In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died the richest man in America, worth $105 million. His fortune was larger than the entire United States Treasury. It seemed eternal, untouchable, destined to outlast empires. And yet, by 1973, when 120 of his descendants gathered for a family reunion, not a single one of them was a millionaire. The greatest American fortune of the 19th century had evaporated. This is the story of how a dynasty that built palaces, controlled railroads, and redefined American wealth destroyed itself in 3 generations. Not through tragedy, through excess. Chapter 1: The Education of a Monster. Cornelius Vanderbilt learned to hate poverty before he learned to read, and that hatred built an empire. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island in a house that leaked when it rained. His father operated a small ferry, rowing passengers across New York Harbor for pennies. The family ate what they could afford, which was rarely enough. Young Cornelius wore the same shirt until it rotted off his back. He watched his mother scrub floors for wealthy families and learned the first lesson that would define his life. Being poor was a choice made by the weak. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother. The terms were brutal. He would buy a small sailing vessel and ferry cargo across the harbor. If he succeeded, he would repay her with interest. If he failed, she would lose everything she had saved. He succeeded. Within a year, he owned 3 boats. Within 5 years, and he controlled harbor traffic between Staten Island and Manhattan. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. He undercut competitors by 20% and drove them into bankruptcy. When other ferry operators tried to match his prices, he dropped his rates further, operating at a loss until they collapsed. Then he raised prices higher than before. By age 23, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated $9,000. He could barely write his own name, but he understood numbers with savage clarity. Every dollar was a soldier in a war against poverty. Every competitor was an enemy to be destroyed. Compassion was a luxury for people who could afford to fail. He married young, to a woman named Sophia. She bore him 13 children. He barely noticed. The harbor consumed him. By 1829, he owned the largest ferry and freight operation in New York. His boats moved faster, carried more, cost less. He drove wages down, maintenance costs down, everything down except profit. His workers hated him. His competitors feared him. His wealth grew. The newspapers called him Commodore, a mocking title for a man who had never served in any navy. He kept it, let them laugh. He was worth $500,000 by 1840, while they scribbled for wages. The lesson was complete. Poverty was not fate, it was failure, and Cornelius Vanderbilt would never fail again. Chapter 2: The Commodore's Calculation. When Cornelius Vanderbilt entered the railroad business at age 70, his competitors thought he was too old to matter. They were wrong about everything. By 1862, Vanderbilt had spent 4 decades dominating steamship traffic along the East Coast and across to Central America. He was worth $15 million. Most men would have retired to count their fortune. Vanderbilt saw an opportunity that made steamships look like toys. The railroads were a mess. Dozens of small lines, incompatible tracks, inefficient routes. They competed against each other, driving down profits. They answered to state legislatures that could be bought cheaply. And most importantly, they were run by men who still believed in fair competition. Vanderbilt believed in consolidation. He began with the New York and Harlem Railroad. the line was failing, its stock trading at $9 a share. Vanderbilt bought quietly, accumulating shares through intermediaries. When he controlled enough to matter, he approached the New York City Council with a proposal: grant the Harlem Line a streetcar monopoly on Broadway, and Vanderbilt would modernize the entire operation. The council agreed. The stock jumped to $75 a share. Then the council members, who had bought shares before the vote, tried to get richer. They reversed their decision, expecting the stock to crash so they could buy more at the bottom. But Vanderbilt had anticipated the betrayal. He bought every share they tried to sell. He cornered the market completely. The council members had sold short, betting the price would fall. Instead, it climbed to $179 per share. The council members were ruined. Vanderbilt was $10 million richer, and he owned the Harlem Railroad outright. And he repeated the strategy with the Hudson River Railroad, then the New York Central. Each acquisition used the same method: buy control, manipulate the legislature, crush anyone who opposed him, consolidate the profit. By 1867, Vanderbilt controlled every major rail line entering New York City. He was 73 years old. His fortune had grown to $30 million. Competitors who had dismissed him as a relic now begged for mercy. He gave none. The New York Central became his masterpiece. He merged 4 competing lines into one system, standardized the gauge, eliminated redundant routes, and fired half the workforce. Efficiency, he called it. Theft, his enemies said. Genius, the ledgers proved. By 1870, Vanderbilt controlled over 4,000 miles of track. His railroads moved more freight than any system in America. His personal wealth exceeded $50 million, and he was just beginning. Newspapers called him a robber baron. Ministers preached against his greed. Congress investigated his stock manipulations. None of it mattered. The money poured in faster than his enemies could count it. Cornelius Vanderbilt had learned young that poverty was a choice. Now, at 76, he proved that wealth was a calculation, and he had calculated perfectly. Chapter 3: 105 Million Reasons to Fear Death. In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt lay dying, surrounded by fortune and obsessed with who would destroy it. He was 82 years old. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp enough to see the future. And what he saw terrified him. And he had 13 children. Most of them disgusted him. His eldest son, Cornelius Jeremiah, was a gambling addict who had blown through every dollar his father ever gave him. Vanderbilt had already cut him off twice. His daughters had married men he despised, society climbers who saw the Vanderbilt name as a vault to raid. They threw parties, wore expensive clothes, lived in houses they could not afford. They had his blood, but none of his discipline. Then there was William. William Henry Vanderbilt was the second son, 40 years spent in his father's shadow. The Commodore called him a fool, a blatherer, a man unfit to manage even a small farm. For decades, William had been exiled to a struggling railroad on Staten Island, kept away from the real empire. He had proven himself competent there, profitable even, but his father never noticed. As death approached, Vanderbilt faced an impossible choice. Split the fortune among 13 heirs and watch it fragment into nothing within a generation. Or give it all to one person and pray they would be ruthless enough to keep it. He chose William. The will was brutal in its clarity. William would receive $95 million, nearly the entire estate. The New York Central Railroad, the Michigan Central, the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern, all of it. The other children would split the remaining $10 million, with most going to establish trust funds for the daughters. Cornelius Jeremiah received the bare minimum required by law. The income from a $200,000 trust, enough to survive but never to thrive. The family exploded in rage. How could the old man give everything to William, the son he had mocked for 40 years? The daughters hired lawyers. Cornelius Jeremiah threatened to contest the will, claiming his father had been mentally incompetent. But the Commodore had anticipated this too. He had doctors testify to his soundness of mind. He had witnesses to his lucidity, and he had the leverage of shame. If they fought, he had arranged for evidence of their debts, affairs, and failures to become public. The challenges collapsed. On January 8, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died in his mansion on Washington Place. His funeral was a spectacle. Thousands lined the streets. Ministers praised his vision, his determination, his generosity, conveniently forgetting the enemies he had crushed and the workers he had exploited. His estate was valued at $105 million. In an era when the average American worker earned $500 per year, Vanderbilt's fortune represented the labor of 210,000 people working for an entire year. It was more than the United States government had in its treasury. It was, at that moment, the largest personal fortune ever accumulated in America. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited it all with one mandate: keep it together. The Commodore knew exactly what would happen if the fortune scattered. He had seen wealth dissolve before, had watched rich families crumble into genteel poverty within a generation. His final words were not recorded, but his final calculation was clear in the will. Money did not care about fairness or love or family harmony. Money required ruthlessness, and William, whatever his flaws, had at least learned to manage a railroad. Whether he had learned anything else remained to be seen. Chapter 4. When the heir proved them all wrong. William Henry Vanderbilt was called a fool by his own father, yet he doubled the fortune in 8 years. The business world waited for him to fail. The newspapers predicted disaster. His own siblings expected him to fumble the empire within months. Instead, William Henry Vanderbilt became the richest man in the world. He was 56 when he inherited. He had spent decades humiliated by his father, mocked in public, assigned to minor roles while younger, flashier men received credit for his work. But humiliation had taught him something more valuable than ego: patience. William took control of the New York Central Railroad in 1877 and immediately began to expand. While his father had consolidated existing lines, William saw the future in westward growth. He pushed the railroad toward Chicago, buying smaller lines, building new track, bribing legislators just as efficiently as the Commodore ever had. The Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway became his prize. William merged it fully into the Central system, creating an unbroken line from New York to Chicago. Freight that once required multiple transfers now moved on Vanderbilt track the entire way. Efficiency meant profit. Profit meant power. By 1880, William's fortune had grown to $200 million. He had doubled his inheritance in 3 years. The numbers were staggering. The New York Central system now controlled 8,000 miles of track. It employed 30,000 workers. It moved 40 million tons of freight annually. Revenue exceeded $40 million per year, with profit margins the Commodore himself would have envied. William proved to be a more capable executive than anyone, including his father, had imagined. He modernized signaling systems, upgraded locomotives, standardized operations across the entire network. He cut costs without sacrificing safety, squeezed suppliers without alienating them entirely, and played political games with the cold precision his father had taught by example. But something had shifted. The Commodore had lived in modest homes, even at the peak of his wealth. He wore simple clothes, ate plain food, spent money only when it generated more money. William had absorbed the business lessons, but not the lifestyle discipline. In 1881, William began construction on a mansion at 645th Avenue in Manhattan. The project would cost $2 million, a sum that represented the net worth of most American millionaires. The house would have 58 rooms, caen facades, carved wood interiors imported from Europe, stained glass by John Lafarge, and enough marble to build a monument. He told himself it was necessary. A man of his position required a home that reflected his status. The Astors had their mansions. The Rockefellers were building palaces. The Vanderbilts could not appear inferior. The house took 3 years to complete. When it opened in 1884, newspapers called it the finest private residence in America. William walked through rooms paneled in Santo Domingo mahogany, beneath ceilings painted by European masters, across floors of inlaid marble. He felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, that he had escaped his father's shadow. But the mansion cost $60,000 per year to maintain. Salaries for servants, groundskeepers, cooks, housekeepers, heating bills that exceeded what most families earned in a decade. Repairs, updates, furnishings, insurance. The house was not an investment. It was a drain, permanent and compounding. William barely noticed. The railroad generated millions. 60,000 was nothing. His children noticed everything. William had 8 children who survived to adulthood. They had grown up wealthy, but not spectacularly so. Their grandfather had been rich in ledgers, not lifestyle. Their father had worked constantly, focused on railroads and profit. But now they saw the mansion. They saw the art, the marble, the servants. And they understood that Vanderbilt money could buy more than security. It could buy splendor. William's eldest son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, began planning his own mansion before his father's was even finished. His brother, William Kissam Vanderbilt, hired the same architect. The daughters married men who expected similar estates as wedding gifts. By 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt was worth $230 million. He was the richest man in the world, wealthier than any European royal, any industrial titan, any financier alive. His railroad empire printed money. His investments multiplied. His fortune seemed infinite. He died on December 8th in 1885 at age 64. A stroke took him in the library of his mansion, surrounded by priceless art and furniture he barely had time to enjoy. His estate was divided among his 8 children. Each received approximately $25 million. 4 of them immediately began building mansions that would make their fathers look modest. The Commodore had feared this moment. He had tried to prevent it by consolidating everything with William, but William had succeeded too well. The fortune was so large that even divided 8 ways, each share seemed inexhaustible. The 3rd generation looked at their inheritances and saw unlimited possibility. What they failed to see was the lesson their grandfather had understood. Money was not a resource to be spent. It was a weapon to be wielded, and they had just transformed it into decoration. Chapter 5. the palaces that announced the end. The Vanderbilt mansions were not homes. They were declarations that the family had stopped thinking like entrepreneurs and started thinking like royalty. Between 1883 and 1905, the Vanderbilt family built or acquired 11 major estates. Each one represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth required. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. Construction began in 1893 after the original wooden structure burned down. The replacement would be fireproof. It would also be staggering. 70 rooms spread across 125,000 square feet. Italian marble floors, African mahogany walls, gilded plaster ceilings, a dining room that could seat 34 beneath crystal chandeliers imported from France, bathrooms with hot and cold running salt water and fresh water, a kitchen large enough to serve a hotel. The ground floor featured an open-air courtyard modeled after Italian palazzos, because apparently Rhode Island winters were not a concern when you could afford to heat the ocean. The breakers required a permanent staff of 48 servants just to maintain it. Groundskeepers, cooks, maids, footmen, stable hands, laundresses. Each servant received room, board, and wages. The annual operating cost exceeded $100,000, not including major repairs, renovations, or the constant need to replace furnishings destroyed by salt air. Cornelius II visited the breakers approximately 8 weeks per year. The house sat mostly empty, its staff maintaining pristine rooms that no one occupied, polishing silver no one used, preparing meals for ghosts. The construction cost alone exceeded $7 million, equivalent to 140 years of operating expenses for a typical upper-middle-class home. It was not an investment. It generated no income, created no value, served no function beyond announcing that Cornelius Vanderbilt II could afford to waste $7 million on a summer house. But the breakers was modest compared to what his brother built. George Washington Vanderbilt II inherited $10 million when his father died. Most men could have lived magnificently on the interest alone, $500,000 per year. George decided to build a house. Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, would become the largest privately owned home in America. Construction began in 1889 and continued for 6 years. The final structure contained 250 rooms spread across 175,000 square feet of interior space, 4 acres of floor space, 33 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, a library that could hold 23,000 volumes. The estate encompassed 8,000 acres of forest, farmland, and gardens. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, spent years creating the landscaping. Hundreds of workers reshaped the terrain, planting trees, building roads, constructing bridges across streams that were rerouted to improve the view. The construction cost exceeded $6 million. The annual maintenance required 150 full-time staff members and cost approximately $250,000 per year. George lived there alone, a bachelor rattling around in 250 rooms, attended by an army of servants maintaining a house that could have comfortably held 500 people. Biltmore generated no income. It produced nothing. The forests yielded some timber, the farms some crops, but nowhere near enough to offset the crushing annual expense. The estate was a monument to the idea that Vanderbilt wealth would never end, that $10 million could sustain any folly. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898. They had one daughter, 3 people living in a house built for a royal court. Meanwhile, William Kissam Vanderbilt built Marble House, also in Newport, as a birthday gift for his wife Alva. The cost, $11 million, with $7 million spent on marble alone. 500,000 cubic feet of marble, imported from Italy, carved by European artisans, assembled into a summer cottage that Alva would use perhaps 10 weeks per year. The house had 50 rooms, a ballroom modeled after Versailles, a dining room with walls of pink Numidian marble, gold leaf on every surface that could hold it. The servants' quarters alone were larger than most American homes. Marble House cost $200,000 annually to operate. Alva spent approximately $1 million per year on parties, entertainments, and costume balls hosted there. The house was not a home. It was a stage set for displaying wealth to other wealthy people who were equally engaged in competitive spending. Back in Manhattan, the Vanderbilts turned Fifth Avenue into a family corridor. Cornelius II built a mansion at 1 West 57th Street. William K. built at 665th Avenue next to his father's original palace. The cost of these city homes ranged from $3 million to $5 million each. Operating expenses ran $100,000 to $200,000 per year, per house. The family now owned properties that collectively cost over $50 million to build and required well over $1 million annually just to maintain. This did not include parties, staff bonuses, renovations, property taxes, or the constant need to update furnishings to keep pace with changing fashion. The mansions were beautiful. They were also financial disasters in slow motion. In 1900, the total Vanderbilt fortune, spread across the third generation, was estimated at $200 million. The properties they built consumed at least $2 million per year in pure operating costs, not counting mortgages, taxes, or lifestyle expenses. That was a 1% annual drain on capital just to keep the doors open. But the drain was accelerating. Property taxes were rising as cities grew. Servants demanded higher wages. Heating systems needed upgrading. Roofs needed replacing. Marble cracked in winter. Wood rotted in summer. Every mansion was a living thing that ate money constantly, and none of them generated a dollar of income. The Commodore had built his fortune by buying assets that produced cash flow. His descendants built monuments that consumed it. They confused wealth with the appearance of wealth. The mansions proved they were rich. They also guaranteed they would not stay that way. Chapter 6. The Mathematics of Destruction. By 1900, the third generation of Vanderbilts faced a problem their grandfather never imagined. They owned too much house and earned too little. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Cornelius Vanderbilt II inherited approximately $48 million when his father died in 1885. By 1900, 15 years later, his fortune had not grown. It had shrunk to approximately $42 million. The decline was slow but measurable, and it was accelerating. The problem was structural. Cornelius II's income came primarily from dividends on railroad stock and returns on conservative investments. The New York Central Railroad, once the infinite money printer of his grandfather's era, now faced competition from newer, more efficient lines. Government regulation limited rate increases. Labor unions demanded higher wages and safer conditions. The profit margins that had made the Commodore obscenely wealthy were compressing. Cornelius II's annual income from all sources was approximately $2 million. In any rational universe, this was enough to live well. Kings managed on less. But Cornelius was not living rationally. The breakers required $100,000 per year to operate. His mansion at 1 West 57th Street in Manhattan required another $150,000. Property taxes on both estates totaled $75,000. Insurance, $30,000. Yacht maintenance, $50,000. Salaries for personal staff beyond household servants, $40,000. Donations expected of a man of his position, $50,000. Clothing, travel, entertaining, automobiles, gifts, miscellaneous expenses, another $200,000. Total annual expenditure, $695,000. And that was before any major repairs, renovations, or unexpected costs. Cornelius had roughly $1.3 million left over each year. He invested it conservatively, earning perhaps 5%. But inflation eroded value. Market downturns destroyed principal. And every few years, one of his properties required a major renovation that cost hundreds of thousands. The math was relentless. He was not spending more than he earned, but he was spending almost everything he earned. The fortune was not compounding. It was holding steady at best, declining at worst. His siblings faced similar arithmetic. William K. Vanderbilt, who inherited a similar share, maintained Marble House, a Manhattan mansion, a country estate on Long Island, a racing yacht, and a car collection that cost more than most people's homes. His annual expenses exceeded $700,000. George Vanderbilt's situation was even more dire. Biltmore required $250,000 annually just to keep operational. His inheritance of $10 million, invested conservatively, generated perhaps $500,000 per year in income. He was operating at a loss, draining capital every year to maintain a house that served no purpose beyond satisfying his vision of a Southern aristocratic estate. By 1910, George had sold off portions of the forest to raise cash. The estate that once encompassed 125,000 acres had been reduced to 8,000. He would spend the rest of his life struggling to keep Biltmore from bankrupting him entirely. The fourth generation was already arriving, and they expected the lifestyle they had witnessed. Mansions, servants, yachts, private rail cars, European tours, debutante balls that cost $50,000 per event. They had no concept that the money was finite, because the money still looked infinite. $40 million was an incomprehensible sum. Bank accounts still held millions. Stock portfolios generated dividends. The family name commanded respect and credit. No one was poor. No one was even middle class. The decline was happening in ledgers, in compound interest that should have been accumulating, but was instead being spent on marble floors and gold leaf. The Vanderbilts were committing slow financial suicide, one beautiful room at a time. And then the government made it worse. In 1916, Congress passed the Revenue Act, establishing a federal estate tax. When a Vanderbilt died, the government would claim a portion of their wealth before it passed to heirs. The initial rate was 10% on estates over $5 million. Within a few years, it would climb much higher. The estate tax transformed inheritance from a simple transfer into a forced liquidation event. When William K. Vanderbilt died in 1920, his estate was valued at $54 million. After taxes, legal fees, and debts, his heirs received approximately $38 million. $16 million, nearly one-third of the fortune, vanished into government coffers and lawyers' pockets. Each death became a reduction event, and the Vanderbilts kept dying. Cornelius II died in 1915. His son Alfred died on the Lusitania in 1915. William K. in 1920. George in 1914. Each death triggered taxes. Each tax triggered asset sales. Each sale reduced the capital base generating income. Meanwhile, the expenses continued. The mansions still required maintenance. The servants still needed wages. Property taxes, insurance, heating, repairs, none of it stopped because the fortune was shrinking. The fourth generation inherited wealth, but they inherited it in fragments, spread across trusts designed to prevent any single heir from controlling enough to waste it all at once. The trusts had seemed wise when established. Now they created a new problem. No individual Vanderbilt had enough concentrated capital to generate significant income, but they all had enough to feel entitled to an expensive lifestyle. By 1930, the mathematics had become undeniable. The collective Vanderbilt fortune, spread across dozens of descendants, was still substantial, perhaps 150 million in total. But divided among 40 people, with each maintaining some version of the family lifestyle, the money was evaporating. The mansions that had announced the family's supremacy now announced its doom. Every marble column was a bet that income would always exceed expenses. Every gilded ceiling assumed the future would be richer than the past. Every room no one used was capital destroyed for aesthetics. The Commodore had understood that wealth required discipline. William had understood it less. The third generation had forgotten it entirely, and the fourth generation never learned it at all. The houses stood, beautiful and patient, waiting for the money to run out. Chapter 7. The Society that Consumed Everything. Alva Vanderbilt spent $3 million on a single costume ball and established the family tradition of spectacular waste. The party took place on March 26, 1883, at the newly completed mansion of William K. and Alva Vanderbilt at 660 Fifth Avenue. It would become the most infamous social event of the Gilded Age, and the clearest symbol of how the Vanderbilt fortune was being transformed from capital into theater. Alva had a problem. New York society, controlled by Mrs. Caroline Astor and her court of old money families, refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilts as social equals. The family was too new, too crude, too obviously commercial. Alva, who had married into Vanderbilt wealth from a respectable but financially struggling Southern family, intended to force the issue. She planned a costume ball so elaborate, so expensive, so spectacular that society would have no choice but to attend. The invitations went to 1,200 guests. The preparation took 2 months. The mansion itself had cost $3 million to build. For the ball, Alva spent another $3 million on temporary decorations. The ballroom was transformed into a tropical garden, with palm trees imported from Florida, orchids from South America, and thousands of roses arranged to bloom simultaneously. The dining room featured a fountain surrounded by flowers, with wine flowing instead of water. Every room was filled with musicians, performers, and tableaux vivants. The guests arrived in costumes that cost fortunes themselves. Alva appeared as a Venetian princess in a gown that required 6 months to create, encrusted with jewels worth $200,000. Her sister-in-law dressed as an electric light, with a gown covered in battery-powered bulbs, a technological marvel that cost $30,000. Other guests came as French royalty, Roman emperors, Renaissance nobles, each trying to outspend the others. Mrs. Astor's daughter desperately wanted to attend, But Mrs. Astor had not yet formally acknowledged Alva's social existence. The solution was simple. Mrs. Astor paid a personal call to Alva's mansion, the ultimate sign of social capitulation. Alva had won. The cost, $6 million, more than the United States government spent on education that year. The ball succeeded in its purpose. The Vanderbilts were now undeniably part of New York's social elite, and Alva had established a new standard. Wealth was not meant to be hoarded or invested. It was meant to be displayed, performed, transformed into spectacle. The family embraced this philosophy with enthusiasm. Costume balls became annual traditions. Alva hosted another in 1896, themed as a Venetian fete. Cost $2 million. Cornelius II and his wife Alice hosted a ball for their daughter Gertrude's debut in 1900. $1.5 million spent on a single evening to introduce a 17-year-old to society. The parties were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a broader transformation in how the Vanderbilts understood money. William K. Vanderbilt developed a passion for yacht racing. He commissioned the Defender, a racing yacht that cost $500,000 to build and required a crew of 40. The boat existed solely to compete for the America's Cup, a trophy with no monetary value. When Defender won in 1895, William commissioned an even larger yacht, Valiant, for $600,000. His brother Cornelius II ordered a steam yacht named North Star, modeled after his grandfather's vessel, but 10 times larger. Construction cost, $800,000. Annual operating expenses, $150,000. The ship was used approximately 3 weeks per year for pleasure cruises. Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, became obsessed with coaching, the sport of driving horse-drawn carriages in elaborate competitions. He assembled a collection of antique coaches, each restored to pristine condition at costs exceeding $50,000 per vehicle. He employed professional coachmen, maintained stables for dozens of matched horse teams, and hosted coaching weekends where guests competed in costume while servants served champagne from silver buckets. The total cost of this hobby exceeded $2 million over 10 years. Thus, the return on investment, ribbons and trophies. Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of William K. and Alva, was married to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. The wedding was a transaction barely disguised as romance. The Duke needed money to maintain Blenheim Palace. The Vanderbilts wanted a title. Alva negotiated a settlement, $2.5 million in cash, plus $100,000 in railroad stock generating annual dividends. Consuelo was 18 years old. She wept through the ceremony. The marriage was miserable. She would eventually divorce the Duke, but the money was gone, transferred to British aristocracy in exchange for the privilege of calling her daughter's children lords. The pattern repeated across the family. Every social ambition, every hobby, every whim was financed without hesitation. When automobile racing became fashionable, William K. built a private racetrack on Long Island and imported European race cars. When opera became the mark of culture, the Vanderbilts rented entire opera houses for private performances. When art collecting became competitive, they bought old masters by the dozen, paying record prices at auction simply to prevent rivals from acquiring the pieces. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney developed a genuine passion for art and established the Whitney Museum. But even this relatively productive venture cost millions to establish and millions more to maintain. The museum would survive, but only because Gertrude's heirs would eventually donate it to become a public institution, unable to afford its continuation as a private collection. The spending was not random. It was systematic, and driven by a social structure that measured worth through visible expenditure. The Vanderbilts were competing with the Astors, the Belmonts, the Goulds, all equally committed to transforming wealth into spectacle. But the others had ongoing businesses generating cash flow. The Astors owned half of Manhattan and collected rent. The Rockefellers controlled oil refineries, printing money daily. The Vanderbilts had railroad stock, and the railroads were slowly dying. By 1920, the parties continued, but the fortune was demonstrably smaller. The fourth generation still hosted balls, still commissioned yachts, still bought art. But now they were selling off assets to finance the lifestyle. Smaller estates were liquidated. Stock was sold. Trust funds were invaded for capital rather than living on income alone. The society pages celebrated each event. Photographers captured the gowns, the jewels, the elaborate decorations. Magazines praised the Vanderbilt style, the Vanderbilt elegance, the Vanderbilt commitment to beauty and culture. None of them mentioned the cost. None calculated what $3 million invested in 1900 at 5% compound interest would be worth in 1930. None asked why a family that once owned railroads was now primarily famous for parties. Alva Vanderbilt had proven that money could buy social acceptance. What she had not proven was that social acceptance was worth the price. Chapter 8. The Illusion of Permanence. While the Vanderbilts hosted parties in marble halls, the fortune was quietly dying in ledgers no one bothered to read. The family understood, in abstract terms, that they were spending a lot of money. What they failed to understand was that the money had stopped growing decades earlier. The Commodore's fortune had compounded at approximately 15% annually during his lifetime. Every dollar became $1.15, then $1.32, then $1.51. The growth was geometric, relentless, seemingly infinite. William Henry Vanderbilt had maintained 8 to 10% growth through railroad expansion and careful investment. The fortune doubled in his 8-year stewardship, not through luck, but through active management. The third generation saw 0% growth. Some family members even achieved negative growth, their inheritances shrinking year by year, despite receiving substantial annual incomes. The shift was invisible to them because they had never experienced the alternative. They inherited wealth. They did not build it. They understood dividends and trust funds, but not the brutal arithmetic of capital formation. By 1910, the Vanderbilt Railroad holdings faced structural collapse. The New York Central, once the crown jewel, was being challenged by newer, more efficient competitors. The Pennsylvania Railroad had built superior routes. Upstart lines offered faster service. Federal regulation, particularly the Hepburn Act of 1906, limited the rate manipulation and monopolistic practices that had made the Commodore's fortune. The railroad stock that constituted the bulk of family wealth was stagnant. Dividends were maintained, but only by reducing capital improvements and deferring maintenance. But the underlying asset was slowly rotting. Worse, the family had failed to diversify effectively. Several Vanderbilts attempted to enter new industries. Harold Vanderbilt invested in aviation companies. Frederick invested in automotive manufacturing. These ventures failed, losing millions because the Vanderbilts brought money but not expertise. They were passive investors in fields that required active management. The one exception was Cornelius Vanderbilt III, who invested heavily in railroads outside the family system, particularly Western lines. He made money initially, then lost most of it in the railroad bankruptcies that followed the Panic of 1907. the Great Depression destroyed what remained of the illusion. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, Vanderbilt holdings evaporated along with everyone else's. Railroad stocks, already weak, became nearly worthless. Trust fund values plummeted. Income from investments dried up almost overnight. But the expenses did not decrease. The mansion still required staff. Property taxes were still due. Insurance premiums had to be paid. The Vanderbilts could not simply turn off a 70-room house and walk away. They were trapped by their own magnificence. Family members began selling assets in earnest. Artwork went to auction. Smaller properties were sold at distressed prices. Stocks were dumped at losses to raise cash for immediate expenses. Each sale reduced the capital base, which reduced future income, which required more sales. The death spiral was mathematical and inevitable. Reginald Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, inherited $5 million. He spent it on horses, parties, and failed business ventures. By 1925, he was essentially broke. His daughter Gloria would inherit what remained, roughly $4 million in trust, but Reginald himself died, owing more than he owned. Gloria's custody battle in the 1930s became a public spectacle that revealed just how far the family had fallen. Her mother and aunt fought over control of her trust fund, each accusing the other of financial mismanagement and extravagance. The newspapers covered every detail. The public learned that the great Vanderbilt fortune now consisted of trust funds so small they generated barely enough income to maintain a single mansion. Gloria inherited $4 million in 1932. By 1950, most of it was gone, and it consumed by legal fees, taxes, and the simple cost of living as a Vanderbilt was expected to live. The divorces accelerated the dispersal. Alva divorced William Kay and married Oliver Belmont, taking a settlement of $10 million with her. Consuelo divorced the Duke of Marlborough and received a settlement funded by her family. Each divorce was a fragmentation event, splitting wealth that could barely sustain one household into two. Inheritance taxes, which had started at 10%, climbed to 70% on the largest estates by 1935. When a Vanderbilt died, the government claimed the majority. This was not wealth transfer. It was wealth destruction. By 1940, the collective Vanderbilt fortune, spread across approximately 60 descendants, was estimated at $75 million total. This sounds substantial until divided. $1.25 million per person on average. Many had far less. A few had slightly more. $1.25 million, invested conservatively, might generate $60,000 per year in income. This was enough to live comfortably. It was not enough to maintain a mansion, employ a staff, travel extensively, and participate in the social competitions that defined Vanderbilt identity. The fourth and fifth generations faced an impossible choice: abandon the lifestyle and live within their means, or continue spending and watch the money disappear entirely. Most chose to keep spending. The mansions began to close. The breakers became too expensive for the family to maintain, and was leased to the Preservation Society of Newport County. The Fifth Avenue mansions were sold to developers who demolished them to build apartment buildings. Marble House was gifted to the Preservation Society in exchange for tax benefits. Biltmore remained in family hands, but only by transforming it into a tourist attraction. George Vanderbilt's grandson opened it to paying visitors in 1930, charging admission to tour the house his great-grandfather had built as a private residence. The irony was perfect. The Vanderbilts now had to charge strangers to walk through their home just to afford to keep it. Each mansion's fate was an admission of failure. These buildings had been constructed as permanent declarations of wealth. Now they survived only by becoming museums, monuments to a family that had consumed itself. The family members who remained wealthy had achieved it by doing the one thing the previous generations refused to do. They got jobs. Gloria Vanderbilt became a fashion designer, building a jeans empire in the 1970s. Anderson Cooper, her son, became a journalist. They worked, earned, created value. They lived on what they made, not what they inherited. The family fortune, as a unified entity, no longer existed. It had been divided, spent, taxed, and dispersed beyond recovery. What remained were fragments, individual holdings, personal estates that had no connection to the larger dynasty. The Commodore's $105 million fortune, worth over $3 billion in inflation-adjusted terms, had taken 100 years to disappear completely. The mansion stood as evidence. Beautiful, expensive, useless evidence of what happens when spending becomes an identity and wealth becomes performance. By Chapter 9, when the last fortune broke, Gloria Vanderbilt inherited $4 million in 1932, a vast sum that would be gone before she turned 30. She was 8 years old when her father Reginald died, leaving her as the last heir to his branch of the family fortune. The money was held in trust, managed by guardians, supposedly protected from waste and mismanagement. It was protected from nothing. Her mother, also named Gloria, immediately began fighting for control of the trust. Her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, one of the wealthiest women in America and founder of the Whitney Museum, fought back. The custody battle lasted 2 years and became the most sensational trial of the decade. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. Every detail was published. Gloria's mother was portrayed as a neglectful, party-obsessed aristocrat who had abandoned her daughter to chase European nobility. Gertrude was depicted as the responsible, maternal figure who actually cared for the child. The truth was simpler. Both women wanted control of the money. The legal fees consumed hundreds of thousands. Private investigators, lawyers, expert witnesses, all billing by the hour to determine who would manage a fortune that was shrinking daily. The judge eventually awarded custody to Gertrude, ruling that Gloria's mother was unfit, but the damage was done. By the time Gloria turned 21 in 1945 and gained full control of her inheritance, the $4 million had been reduced to $2.8 million. Legal fees, management fees, taxes, and the simple cost of maintaining her in the style expected of a Vanderbilt had eaten the rest. Gloria tried to preserve what remained. She married, divorced, married again. Each marriage came with settlements, divisions of property, additional legal fees. She lived well, traveled extensively, moved in social circles where spending was competitive and expected. By 1955, most of the money was gone. She was not a wastrel. She had not gambled it away or spent it on drugs. She had simply lived as a Vanderbilt woman was supposed to live. Beautiful homes, fashionable clothes, appropriate society, generous gifts. The money could not sustain it. In the 1970s, Gloria did something her ancestors would have found incomprehensible. She went to work. She became a fashion designer, licensing her name for a line of designer jeans that became wildly successful. At her peak, Gloria Vanderbilt jeans generated over $200 million in annual revenue. She earned more money through work than she had ever inherited. And she did it by creating value, building a brand, solving a market need. The skills her great-great-great-grandfather had used to build the fortune, she rediscovered by necessity. Her success was the exception. Most of her cousins simply ran out of money. By 1973, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the collective assessment was brutal. Not a single attendee was a millionaire. Some were comfortable, many were middle class, a few were struggling. Yeah, but none possessed the kind of wealth that characterized earlier generations. The fortune had not been reduced, it had been eliminated. The reunion itself was a study in contrasts. They gathered at a university founded with Commodore Vanderbilt's money, one of his few philanthropic gestures, walking through buildings paid for by a fortune that no longer existed in family hands. The attendees compared notes. Most worked for a living: teachers, middle managers, small business owners. They drove ordinary cars, lived in ordinary houses, worried about ordinary expenses. The Vanderbilt name still carried social weight, but it carried no financial power. Some had tried to preserve family traditions. A few still maintained vacation homes in Newport, though nothing approaching the scale of the Breakers. Others collected antiques or art, holding on to fragments of the family's material culture. But these were hobbies, not inheritances. The mathematics of dispersion had completed its work. The Commodore's fortune, divided among 13 heirs in the first generation, had been subdivided further with each death. By the fifth generation, 120 people shared what remained of a fortune that had once belonged to one man. Even if the original 105 million had been perfectly preserved and invested at a modest 5% annually, divided among 120 people in 1973, each would have inherited approximately 23 million. Substantial, but not dynastic. But the fortune had not been preserved. It had been spent on mansions, yachts, parties, failed businesses, legal fees, taxes, and the thousand small expenses of maintaining an aristocratic lifestyle without aristocratic income. The reunion attendees were not bitter. They had never known real wealth. It had disappeared before most of them were born. They were simply Americans with a famous last name and a peculiar family history. What they did understand, perhaps more clearly than their ancestors, was that the Vanderbilt fortune had not been stolen or lost to bad luck. It had been spent, deliberately, consistently, enthusiastically spent over 3 generations by people who believed wealth was infinite. The Commodore had known better. He had built the fortune from nothing, clawed it from competitors, defended it against politicians and rivals. He understood that money was not a gift. It was a weapon that required constant maintenance. His children had learned the lesson imperfectly. His grandchildren had forgotten it. His great-grandchildren never knew it existed. By 1973, the lesson was complete. The greatest American fortune of the 19th century had been transformed into a cautionary tale. The mansions remained, but they belonged to preservation societies and tourism boards. The name remained, but it was attached to middle-class bank accounts and ordinary careers. Gloria Vanderbilt would live to 95, dying in 2019. Her obituaries mentioned the jeans empire she built, the art she created, the 4 marriages, the famous son Anderson Cooper, who became a television journalist. They mentioned the custody trial. They mentioned the Breakers and Biltmore. What they did not mention was inherited wealth, because by the time she died, there was none left to mention. She had earned her money. She had worked for it, just like her great-great-great-grandfather, the illiterate ferry boat operator who hated poverty enough to build an empire. The circle was complete. The fortune had returned to its beginning. 0, waiting for someone hungry enough to build it again. Chapter 10. What the mansions became. The Vanderbilt palaces still stand, but as museums, hotels, and monuments to a family that could not afford to keep them. The Breakers, the 70-room summer cottage that cost $7 million to build and $100,000 per year to maintain, was leased to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948. The Vanderbilt family could no longer justify the expense of maintaining a house they used a few weeks annually. In 1972, Countess Gladys Szechenyi, daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, sold the Breakers to the Preservation Society for $365,000. The value had collapsed. A mansion that cost $7 million to build sold for 5% of its construction cost. Today, the Breakers operates as a museum. Tourists pay $27 per adult to tour rooms that once hosted private family dinners. They walk across marble floors imported from Italy, beneath crystal chandeliers from France, through bedrooms where Vanderbilt children slept. Guides explain the architecture, the art, the historical context. What the guides do not mention is that this house bankrupted the family that built it. That every beautiful room represented capital destroyed. That the family sold it because they could not afford to keep the lights on. The Preservation Society now maintains the Breakers for approximately $2 million annually, funded by ticket sales and donations. The operating cost has increased 20-fold since the Vanderbilts lived there. Even as a tourist attraction, the house barely breaks even. Marble House met a similar fate. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont gave the house to the Preservation Society in 1932 as a memorial to her late husband. The gift was partly philanthropic, partly practical. She could not afford to maintain it, and the donation generated tax benefits that offset other expenses. The house now operates as a museum and event venue. Weddings are held in the ballroom where Alva once hosted costume balls costing millions. The rental fee is $15,000 for 4 hours. The Preservation Society uses the income to offset maintenance costs that exceed $1 million annually. Biltmore Estate in Asheville took a different path. George Vanderbilt's daughter, Cornelia, inherited the property in 1914 when her father died. She married and had children, but the Depression made maintaining the estate impossible on family resources alone. In 1930, the family made a desperate choice: open Biltmore to paying tourists. They charged $1 admission to tour the ground floor. The public could now walk through a private home, gawking at the ballroom, the library, the indoor pool that George Vanderbilt had built for his exclusive use. The tourist operation saved the estate. Revenue from admissions covered maintenance costs that the family inheritance could not sustain. Over decades, Biltmore evolved into a full commercial operation: a hotel, restaurants, a winery, shops selling Biltmore-branded merchandise. Today, Biltmore Estate remains privately owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants, but it is a business, not a residence. The family lives in a small portion of the house. The rest is a tourist attraction that generates over $300 million in annual revenue and employs thousands. It survived by ceasing to be a home and becoming a product. The Fifth Avenue mansions fared worse. The Vanderbilt corridor, that once dominated the most expensive real estate in Manhattan, was systematically demolished. Cornelius II's mansion at 1 West 57th Street was sold in 1926 and demolished to make way for the Bergdorf Goodman department store. The palazzo that cost $5 million to build was erased in weeks, its marble sold as salvage, its artwork auctioned, its memory preserved only in photographs. William K. Vanderbilt's mansion at 665th Avenue was demolished in 1927. The site became a commercial building. Alva's $3 million palace, the site of the legendary costume ball, was reduced to rubble and carted away. The demolitions were not acts of vandalism. They were economic necessities. The mansions occupied land worth millions, but generated no income. Property taxes alone cost hundreds of thousands annually. A department store or office building on the same land could generate enough revenue to justify the location. The Vanderbilt heirs sold the properties because maintaining them was financial suicide. The buyers demolished them because empty palaces were worthless compared to productive commercial space. One by one, the monuments disappeared. By 1940, the Vanderbilt presence on Fifth Avenue had been erased. The street that once announced their dominance now showed no evidence they had ever existed. What remains are fragments. The Biltmore Hotel in Manhattan, built by family members in 1913, still operates, though under different ownership. A few smaller Vanderbilt properties survive as private residences, owned by descendants who work for a living and maintain them on earned income, not inherited wealth. The mansions that survive as museums are beautiful. They are also instructive. Every preserved room is a lesson in what wealth cannot buy: permanence. The marble is still perfect. The gilding still shines. The craftsmanship is still extraordinary. But the family that commissioned these palaces could not afford to keep them. Beauty alone could not generate the income required for survival. Tourists walk through the breakers and marvel at the excess. They should also marvel at the waste. Every chandelier, every carved panel, every imported stone represents capital that could have been invested, could have generated returns, could have sustained the family for generations. Instead, it bought beauty that strangers now pay to photograph. The lesson is complete. The mansions stand as monuments to a family that confused wealth with spending, that believed appearance mattered more than arithmetic, that built palaces when they should have built portfolios. The buildings survived, the fortune did not. And that distinction tells the entire story. Chapter 11. The reunion where no one was rich. In 1973, 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered, and their combined wealth could not match their great-great-grandfather's fortune from a single year. The reunion took place at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. The location was symbolic. The university had been founded in 1873 with a $1 million gift from Commodore Vanderbilt, one of his rare acts of philanthropy. It was one of the few investments he made that still bore the family name with any significance. The descendants came from across America. Some flew in from California, others drove from nearby southern states. They ranged in age from children to elderly members of the fourth generation. They shared a last name and a legendary ancestor. They shared almost nothing else. The organizers had prepared name tags, genealogical charts, displays of family history. Photographs of the mansions lined the walls. Images of the breakers, Biltmore, the Fifth Avenue palaces. Portraits of the Commodore, William, the various Corneliuses and Williams who had carried the name forward. The contrast between the images and the attendees was stark. These were not wealthy people. They were teachers, accountants, small business owners, retirees living on modest pensions. They wore ordinary clothes, drove ordinary cars, lived in ordinary homes. A few were comfortable. None were rich in any sense the Commodore would have recognized. Genealogists had estimated that by 1973, the total wealth controlled by all Vanderbilt descendants, combined, was less than $30 million. Divided among 120 people, that averaged $250,000 each. Some had more, many had less. $250,000 in 1973 was enough to buy a nice house. It was not enough to maintain a mansion. The reunion became an exercise in collective reckoning. Family members swapped stories of what had happened to various branches. The descendants of Cornelius II, who had once been the wealthiest, were mostly middle class. The descendants of George Vanderbilt maintained connections to Biltmore, but lived on salaries earned working for the tourist operation. Gloria Vanderbilt did not attend. She was building her fashion empire in New York, creating the wealth her inheritance had failed to preserve. Her absence was noted, but not surprising. She had moved beyond family history into personal achievement. The attendees discussed the mansions they could no longer afford to visit without buying tickets. They laughed about the irony. Their ancestors had built these palaces, and now they paid admission like everyone else. Some expressed bitterness. The fortune should have lasted. It should have been managed better, preserved, invested wisely instead of spent on parties and yachts. Others accepted the outcome as inevitable. Wealth concentrates, then disperses. That is what it does. A few family members brought historical documents, trust fund statements from the 1920s showing annual incomes that exceeded what most attendees now earned in a year. Estate inventories listing artwork, jewelry, property holdings that had long since been sold. Photographs of family members in furs and jewels, standing beside automobiles that cost more than houses. The documents felt like artifacts from a different civilization. The Vanderbilts of 1900 existed in a reality so far removed from 1973 that the connection seemed almost fictional. The organizers had arranged for a financial historian to speak about the family's economic history. He presented the numbers clinically. The Commodore's $105 million, Williams doubling to $230 million, the division among the third generation, the spending on mansions and parties, the erosion through taxes and inflation, the final dispersal. He showed a chart tracking the fortune over time. It peaked in 1885 with Williams' death. It declined gradually through 1920. Then it fell off a cliff during the Depression. By 1950, it was gone. The attendees listened quietly. They already knew the story, but seeing it quantified made it undeniable. The historian posed a question. Could it have been prevented? The answer was obvious. Yes. The fortune could have been preserved through conservative investment, modest spending, and active management. If the third generation had lived on 5% of their capital and invested the rest, if they had avoided the mansions and yachts, if they had treated the inheritance as a sacred trust rather than a spending account, the money would still exist. But that would have required becoming different people. It would have required rejecting the social competition that defined their world. It would have meant living quietly, investing in industries they did not understand, resisting the temptation to build monuments to their own magnificence. The Commodore had built the fortune through brutality, discipline, and obsessive focus on accumulation. Those traits are incompatible with the lifestyle his descendants chose to live. You cannot maintain a fortune built on deprivation by embracing excess. One attendee, a retired teacher and great-great-grandson of William Henry Vanderbilt, summarized it perfectly. We inherited money, but not the character that made it. And money without character is just a temporary condition. The reunion ended with a dinner. The food was catered, modest, paid for by attendee contributions. No one rented an opera house. No one arrived in a yacht. No one wore costumes costing thousands. They ate, talked, exchanged addresses, promised to stay in touch. They were a family bound by history and genetics, but not by wealth. The fortune that had defined their ancestors for 3 generations was now simply a story they told. Some found it tragic, others found it liberating. The burden of maintaining Vanderbilt wealth was gone because there was no wealth left to maintain. They could simply be people with jobs and mortgages and normal concerns. The Commodore had died in 1877, terrified that his fortune would be destroyed. He had tried to prevent it by concentrating everything with William. He had failed. But perhaps he had also misunderstood what could be preserved. The fortune could not last. Wealth is always temporary, subject to division, taxation, inflation, and the simple fact that spending is certain while earning is not. What did survive was the name. The university still bore it. The mansions, now museums, still carried it. The family story, taught in business schools and economic history courses, preserved it. The Vanderbilts lost the money, but they taught the world an invaluable lesson about what money cannot do. It cannot buy permanence. It cannot survive generational transition without discipline. It cannot protect itself from heirs who confuse owning wealth with earning it. The reunion attendees understood this better than their ancestors ever did. They had witnessed the entire arc: creation, expansion, peak, decline, dispersal, dissolution, and they lived with the aftermath. Not a single one was a millionaire, and somehow that was the most instructive outcome of all. Chapter 12. The Lesson Written in Marble and Dust. The Vanderbilt story is not a tragedy. It is a theorem, proven with ledgers and mansions and empty vaults. The theorem is simple. Wealth is created through one set of skills and destroyed through the opposite set. Building a fortune requires deprivation, focus, ruthlessness, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for accumulation. Maintaining a fortune requires the same discipline. But living with a fortune requires something entirely different: comfort, generosity, social engagement, the appearance of ease. These requirements are incompatible. You cannot simultaneously live like you are building wealth and live like you have already built it. The Vanderbilts proved this with mathematical precision. Cornelius Vanderbilt created $105 million by treating every dollar as a soldier, every transaction as a battle, every competitor as an enemy to be eliminated. He lived in modest homes, wore simple clothes, ate plain food, and spent money only when it generated more money. His grandchildren lived in 70-room palaces, hosted parties costing millions, commissioned yachts requiring crews of 40, and spent money primarily to impress other wealthy people engaged in the same competitive display. The transition from the first behavior to the second took 1 generation. The destruction of the fortune took 2 more. This was not bad luck. This was mathematics. Start with $100 million. Assume a conservative 5% annual return through investment. Assume the 3rd generation, divided into 8 heirs, each receives $12.5 million. Now assume each heir spends $500,000 per year maintaining mansions, lifestyles, and social obligations. At 5% return, $12.5 million generates $625,000 in annual income. Spend $500,000 and you have $125,000 left to reinvest. The fortune stays roughly stable, but that assumes only $500,000 in spending. The Vanderbilts were spending far more. Cornelius II spent nearly $700,000 annually just on property maintenance, not including lifestyle costs. When spending exceeds income, you invade principal. Once you invade principal, the capital base shrinks. Once it shrinks, income decreases. Once income decreases, you invade more principal. The death spiral is automatic. Add in inheritance taxes. Add in market downturns. Add in failed business ventures, divorces, lawsuits, and the simple cost of maintaining increasingly expensive properties as labor and material costs rise. The mathematics become impossible. The fortune could not survive, not because the family was unlucky, but because they were spending capital and calling it income. The mansions were the perfect symbol of this confusion. They appeared to be assets. They were actually liabilities. A liability is anything that costs money to maintain. An asset is anything that generates income. The Breakers was $7 million in construction costs that generated zero income and cost $100,000 annually in maintenance. $7 million invested at 5% would generate $350,000 per year in perpetuity. Instead, it was locked into marble and gold that produced beauty, but no cash flow. Every Vanderbilt mansion was a choice to convert productive capital into sterile magnificence. Every yacht, every costume ball, every European tour, every socially necessary expense was the same choice, repeated until the capital was exhausted. The Commodore understood this. That is why he lived modestly, despite being the richest man in America. That is why he consolidated the fortune with William rather than dividing it equally. He knew that dispersal meant destruction, but he could not transmit the discipline that had created the wealth. That discipline had been forged in poverty, hardened by competition, reinforced by 40 years of 18-hour workdays. You cannot inherit it. You have to earn it through deprivation. The third generation never experienced deprivation. They were born into wealth, raised in comfort, educated to appreciate beauty and culture. They were socialized to believe that wealth meant spending, that their worth was measured by visible display, that the family name required maintaining a certain standard. They were doomed from birth, not by fate, but by their own success. This is the pattern with nearly every great fortune. Build, peak, decline, dispersal, dissolution. 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, as the saying goes. The Vanderbilts followed the pattern with textbook precision. Other families broke the cycle, but only through extraordinary measures. The Rockefellers established formal governance structures, family offices, education programs designed to teach each generation that wealth was a responsibility, not a resource. They spent decades institutionalizing the discipline required to preserve capital. The Rothschilds maintained strict rules about who could access family capital, how it could be spent, who could marry into the family. They treated the fortune as a family business requiring active management, not a trust fund to be passively consumed. The Vanderbilts did none of this. They divided the fortune, spent it freely, and assumed it would last forever because they could not imagine it ending. Today, the Vanderbilt name means something different than it did in 1877. It means mansions that are now museums. It means a family reunion where no one is rich. It means a cautionary tale taught in business schools about the difference between creating wealth and keeping it. The lesson is brutal but clear. Wealth is not an inheritance. It is a temporary possession, subject to the same laws of entropy that govern everything else in the universe. Without constant input of energy, discipline, and focus, it disperses. The mansions remain because stone lasts longer than money. The Breakers will stand for centuries, a monument to excess and beauty, and the terminal folly of believing that magnificence can substitute for management. The tourists will pay to walk through those rooms long after the last Vanderbilt descendant has forgotten what it felt like to be rich. The marble is permanent, the fortune was not. And that difference contains the entire truth of the Vanderbilt story. What you build in stone will outlast what you keep in vaults, but only stone is truly yours. Money belongs to whoever can hold it. And the Vanderbilts, for all their mansions and yachts and parties, could not hold it past the third generation. The Commodore would have understood. He built an empire by never forgetting that poverty was one bad decision away. His grandchildren built palaces by forgetting that wealth was equally temporary. The palaces survived, the wealth did not. The lesson is written in every marble column, every gilded ceiling, every room too expensive to keep. Beauty cannot preserve what discipline fails to protect.